Logan the Layman Critic here. I promised I would do another list video for October, so this one will be covering another favorite series of mine, Hammer Studios' Dracula series. Let's talk movies. I'm not ranking this at the bottom because it's a bad movie or because I hate it. In fact, I enjoy every film in this series for one reason or another. This movie's at the bottom because of its tenuous link to Dracula, as well as the rest of the movies. From the blending of kung fu and horror, to its chronology, to its depiction of vampire lore, this entry doesn't really fall into the series continuity. It's more of a one-off than anything. The only real connection it has to the others is Peter Cushing returning as a member of the Van Helsing family. No Christopher Lee in this one, unfortunately. He was done with the series at this point. John Forbes Robertson plays Dracula, appearing at the beginning of the movie and at the end. He isn't given much to do, so there's no way of knowing if he would have been good in the role, plus he's dubbed. His death scene is disappointing too. James Bernard returned as composer after having been absent in the preceding two films. He's got a great score, with callbacks to his theme from the original '58 film. Another positive is the change in locale. Setting it in China and pitting Van Helsing against their native variation of the vampire provided a neat twist. He's sought out by a family of martial artists who are trying to save their village from the seven golden vampires. There's some cool fight scenes, which is the film's big draw, and many of the heroes die, which goes against audience expectation. It's not one of Hammer's best, but it's darn entertaining. This may have my favorite opening of all the movies. Dracula and Van Helsing are fighting atop a coach going at full speed. It crashes, and Dracula is impaled on a broken wheel. Van Helsing finishes the job before succumbing to his own injuries, but one of the Count's disciples arrives just in time to collect some of the vampire's remains for future use. We then jump ahead 100 years, accompanied by a funky theme song by Michael Vickers. That's my big issue with Dracula A.D. 1972. It really emphasizes that last part of the title. The music, the fashion, the lingo, it's all wrapped up in 1970s swinging London. And it hurts any attempt at taking the movie seriously, even though it's being played straight. Thankfully, Peter Cushing returned to the series after a 4-film absence. Even though this Van Helsing is a much older descendant than that of his previous two performances, he's still gripping. He serves as a sort of moral symbol against the antics of his granddaughter and her friends. Because of his age, he isn't taken seriously, but he eventually proves the merit of the old ways when he's the last defense against Dracula. After Terence Fisher left the series, the movies ceased to be morality plays veiled as horror stories, but this film is a slight return to that approach. Christopher Lee isn't given much to do, unfortunately. Dracula stays confined to a desecrated church. Instead, Johnny Alucard brings victims to the Count. Johnny Alucard. How anybody thought that name was still clever 29 years after Son of Dracula first did it is beyond me. Anyway, Christopher Neame knows how to play a cunning and unscrupulous character. Johnny offers the youth something new and dangerous, and they buy it. Where Van Helsing represents the wisdom and morality of the past, Johnny represents the attraction of evil with youth and charm. In other words, this movie is depicting the culture war, but with vampires. Brilliant. In the US, this movie is known as Count Dracula and His Vampire Bride. I'm guessing that the distributors thought the original title was a little too provocative. This is one of two movies in the series that I find to be genuinely scary. Part of this is because of the score. John Kakavas made music that creates this surreal, dreamlike atmosphere for the film. But there are some scenes in this movie that are intense. Van Helsing's granddaughter gets trapped inside a cellar full of vampires. They start moving in on her and clawing at her. The combination of the music, the sound effects, and being shot in slow motion makes it extraordinarily unnerving. There's one other scene that stands out, and it's not so much scary as it is disturbing. There's a black mass, and this naked girl, probably in her 20s, is writhing around on an altar. Then she gets stabbed through by a priestess, and she screams at the top of her lungs, and then she dies. And then a few seconds later, her wound heals, her eyes shoot open, and she sits up and smiles. I usually go through these films about once a year, but I always have a hard time with this one because it downright gives me the creeps. This is a direct sequel to AD 1972, and it's an improvement. The bell-bottoms and funk music are gone, allowing us to give the horror our full attention. Several of the characters return, Dracula and Van Helsing, obviously. Michael Coles comes back as Inspector Murray. Jessica Van Helsing's back, but she was recast. Joanna Lumley replaces Stephanie Beacham. The movie is a mixture of horror and spy-fi. Dracula leads a cult of prominent figures that are secretly creating a biological agent to wipe out humanity. The Count is finally given a plan and motivation that goes beyond simple revenge. It's a refreshing change from the norm. If you can't tell, I hold some admiration toward this film. Very few horror movies get under my skin. This one does. Granted, it does have problems. Christopher Lee continued to be underutilized, and the Count's demise is embarrassing. But for being a film made in the twilight years of Hammer horror, this one delivers. I love this poster. That face he makes looks so goofy. Let's put a different poster up. There. That's better. I mentioned that the previous film was one of two in this series that I find genuinely scary. This is the other one. A group of respectable Englishmen lead much different lives in private. They encounter the charismatic Lord Courtley at a brothel, who convinces them to purchase some personal effects of the late Count Dracula. They use the items in a black mass, but things suddenly make a turn for the worse. The men kill Courtley, cover it up, and do their best to pretend the whole thing never happened. What they don't know is that the ritual resurrected Dracula, and the Count wants revenge. One of the things that I like about Christopher Lee's overall portrayal of Dracula is his devotion to the character of the novel. He's Machiavellian in his methods, and this movie demonstrates that. Rather than just kill the men outright, the Count works in the shadows and turns their offspring against them. Their murder is made all the more horrific when they realize in those last few moments that their own sons and daughters have been corrupted and are gleefully indulging themselves in patricide. There may be some subtext relating to the conflict of changing mores between generations. The counterculture was still going on in 1970. Pretty dark stuff regardless. Even though I enjoy Lee's performance, as always, he's not given a whole lot to do. Much of his dialogue consists of him simply counting off the current number of men killed. The character was inserted at the last minute, as Warner Brothers refused to bankroll the film for Hammer, unless it had its star. His presence may be contrived, but I believe it worked to the film's benefit. This is one of James Bernard's more melodic contributions, the love theme being the standout of the whole score. It's very pretty. Lastly, there's some eye-catching visuals. When Dracula opens his eyes again for the first time, they're completely red, and it looks absolutely terrific, super spooky. During the showdown in Dracula's lair, Paul keeps him at bay with a cross that shines this bright white light, penetrating right through the darkness. It's a nice visual representation of Christ being the only force capable of defeating Dracula. Speaking of which, I appreciate the creativity that went into the Count's death scene. I didn't understand it at first. It's depicted in an abstract kind of way. It took me a couple of viewings for it to click, but I'll explain it. Paul breaks into Dracula's lair, which is a desecrated church. He clears all the black mass stuff from the altar and re-sanctifies the church. Dracula shows up, they struggle, Paul blocks the door with a cross. So Dracula tries escaping by climbing up the balcony. He accidentally backs into a stained glass window that has a cross on it. Dracula recoils, and he smashes through the window. He turns back around, and he's suddenly seeing the church as it once was. He's hearing Latin prayers and all that. It overpowers him. He falls off the balcony onto the altar and crumbles into dust. There's no verbal exposition, so this whole bit relies entirely on visuals. It's a unique way of dispatching a vampire, and I've never seen it tried anywhere else. Taste the Blood of Dracula is lacking in screen time for the Count, but Christopher Lee is still awesome, and this may be the most stylized of the bunch, which gives you more than enough reason to watch it. This was the first film in the series to not have Terence Fisher as director, and it's very apparent from the get-go. This movie is much darker than the previous three, and established a more cynical tone for the films that followed. The heroes aren't so pious, the women aren't so virtuous, and the holy men aren't so holy. It needed to be done. The audience had grown up with Fisher's fairy tales, and now it was time for the series to grow up with them. Dracula has risen from the grave depicts the battle between good and evil with nuance. Both sides are still clearly defined, but those caught in the conflict are straddling that line of separation. Example, the hero is Paul, the first of 3 Pauls in the series, oddly enough. He loves Maria, and it later becomes his mission to rescue her from Dracula. Problem is, he's an atheist, and without faith, he can't destroy Dracula. Paul drives a stake through his heart, but he refuses to pray, which is necessary to complete the process of destroying a vampire. So Dracula ends up pulling the stake out, and he escapes to his castle with Maria. Now, Paul becomes a believer by the end, but this movie puts the protagonist in a dilemma. This good man can either stand with God, or, whether through conscious choice or just inaction, he can side with the devil. He must choose where he aligns spiritually and morally. There is no middle ground. Now that I think about it, maybe this movie is more like Terence Fisher's films than I thought. It's just that the morality play angle is concealed within different tropes. Anyway, moving on. Freddie Francis directed this entry. As a cinematographer, he had won an Oscar 8 years prior, so his talent for visuals was already well established. Paired with Arthur Grant as director of photography, this movie looks beautiful. Great use of different colors with lighting and a lens filter that creates this red gold border around the picture. It makes the film feel like a 92-minute dream. It's no coincidence that this film and Taste the Blood of Dracula are the best looking movies. Arthur Grant served as DP on both. There's a few odd inconsistencies with previous films. There's the added step of prayer when staking a vampire that wasn't needed before. Maybe they just did it off screen. Oh well. The other one is when a priest sees Dracula's reflection in water. Now, even if one were to disregard Brides of Dracula establishing the no reflection rule, there's so many other vampire movies out there that this scene must have puzzled or amused audiences at the time. I guess it didn't matter in the end. This was Hammer Studios' most successful film. After distributing 2 successful entries, Warner Brothers decided to pass on this one. Instead, EMI took the reins. Scars of Dracula is still very much a Hammer film, but it lacks the polish and originality of the previous 2 installments. Christopher Lee's makeup is a pasty white for some reason, many of the nighttime scenes are clearly shot during the day, and several plot and character elements have been recycled. So, why is it ranked so high, you ask? Well, to start with, Christopher Lee has the most dialogue and screen time in this movie than in any of the others. We get to see more of his powers. He scales up a wall, he has command over bats. Both are abilities that are featured in the novel, and they never show up again after this movie. He even sends a swarm of bats to kill the women in a nearby village. It's brutal. That's another thing. This is the most violent and gruesome of the Hammer Draculas. It's the first to get an R rating. The Count is a sadistic monster. He tortures his servant, Clove, by putting a red-hot sword against his back, and he smiles as he does it. Patrick Troughton, of Doctor Who fame, he plays said servant. His performance is one of the best in the film. And, of course, this movie has my favorite Hammer girl, Jenny Hanley, and she's a total babe. It's too bad the studio didn't use her in anything after this film. Her looks were wasted on Magpie. And they dubbed her. Not sure why. Again, this film does have its problems. Dracula's resurrection scene is a last-minute tack-on. It's just his disintegration from the last film but played in reverse. The rubber bats, which never looked good in these movies, are shown a lot in this one. Dracula's death scene, it's another weak one. He's struck by lightning, they loop his scream a bunch of times, and the stuntman is wearing this goofy mask as he stumbles around on fire. And there's several unanswered questions regarding continuity with the other movies, like how did Dracula's remains end up back at his castle? Is this the same Clove as the one in Dracula Prince of Darkness? A lot of this can be blamed on the film's rush production. It came out within the very same year as Taste the Blood of Dracula. In my experience, Scars of Dracula creates strong opinions among those who've seen it. It's been trashed by plenty of people, and praised by just as many. I belong in the second camp. For a long time it was my favorite, alongside the '58 film. That's changed in recent years, but I still hold it in high esteem. The title is a misnomer. Dracula never turns these women into vampires. He's not even in this one. The villain of this story is Baron Meinster, a vampire disciple of Dracula. The Count is dead, so Meinster sets out to continue his master's work. Or he would if he wasn't chained up by his mother in the family castle. But he doesn't stay that way for long. Baron Meinster is no Dracula, and David Peel is definitely no Christopher Lee. He's a good enough villain. He has more screen time and dialogue than the Count does in most of these films. He just doesn't have that same imposing presence that Lee radiates. He turns into a bat a couple of times, something that Dracula never does in the Hammer films. The vampire powers and characteristics in Brides of Dracula are more in line with typical vampire movies, but this series goes back and forth and all over the place with what they use and don't use. One of the more intriguing aspects of Brides of Dracula is in its portrayal of vampire lore. All 3 of Terence Fisher's films depict vampirism as a cult, though this one goes into it with a little more depth. In fact, Van Helsing literally refers to it as the cult of the undead. Where most films treat vampirism as a curse or a disease, this one is different. Going from his backstory, Baron Meinster is cruel even from childhood. He keeps company with like-minded people, finding ways to get his kicks, until one day he gets turned into a vampire. So, Meinster isn't a victim. This is merely a new way for him to indulge himself in his depravity. In Fisher's films, and this one more specifically, vampirism is a social disease of the worst kind. It's a hedonism that's literally draining the life from mankind and corrupting it from within. The vampires can be made simply by kissing the victim, which seems like a blatant admonishment against uninhibited sexuality. That Baron Meinster tries to turn Marianne while he's got two other girls on the side is a reinforcement of that idea. Van Helsing, carrying both a medical bag and a crucifix, serves as hero and father figure as he attempts to preserve her virginity. Unfortunately, this angle isn't taken any further in the other movies. There's plenty of material in the sequels relating to cults, but never anything beyond the Black Mass. Dracula Prince of Darkness references it, of course, but only to say that Dracula was the fountainhead. I should go into some of the other stuff. The production design, gorgeous. You know this is the golden age for Hammer when the costumes and sets are made on a B-movie budget but look like they cost twice as much. James Bernard is conspicuously absent, with Malcolm Williamson tackling the score this time around. I dig the opening theme, but nothing else sticks out in mind. Frida Jackson plays the Baron's servant. She's one of the scarier characters. She's got this terrifying cackle. Peter Cushing gets to do some fighting, gets in a brawl with Meinster. It's probably my favorite scene of the whole movie. Even better is how the Baron gets done in. I won't spoil it, I'll only say that it was an inventive method of demise. After an 8-year hiatus from the role, Christopher Lee returned as the Count in 1966. Dracula Prince of Darkness is a well-known film in the Hammer canon, for two reasons. The first is that Dracula has no dialogue. Actually, I take that back. He does have one line. I'm joking, of course, but the character doesn't speak. There's some debate as to why this was done. Christopher Lee claimed that the character's lines were atrocious, so he refused to speak them. The screenwriter, Jimmy Sangster, tells a different story. He maintained that vampires shouldn't spend time talking, and so he chose not to write any lines for Dracula. Now, screenplays go through many drafts and doctoring during production. It's entirely possible that the powers that be decided to insert dialogue once shooting began, and then Christopher Lee ended up pushing back. I see no reason for either Lee or Sangster to have lied. The other distinction of this film is in Dracula's resurrection scene. Clove kills a man, ties the body up by the feet, and suspends it over Dracula's coffin. He pours the Count's dusty remains into the coffin, slices the dead man's throat, and lets the blood drain onto the remains. The scene moves at a deliberate pace. James Bernard takes a minimalist approach toward the music, and the sound of Clove cranking a pulley adds to the ominous atmosphere. It's deliciously macabre and a perfect example of why Hammer dominated the genre in the 60s. The drawback to the sequel is in its plot. It's not a very interesting storyline, and it takes a while to build its momentum. There isn't much we haven't already seen. Terence Fisher's common thematic elements aren't as prominent. There's some attempt to integrate bits of Stoker's novel. We get a Renfield-type character, and Dracula tries to do his blood baptism. The cast is good and bad. Francis Matthews isn't much of a protagonist, but Andrew Keir as Father Shandor makes for a good Van Helsing substitute. Philip Latham plays a much different version of Clove than Patrick Troughton does, but no less effective. Barbara Shelley is the one who really shines, going from uptight Victorian to lascivious vampire. I should also make a point of saying that while Christopher Lee plays Dracula sans dialogue, he's still rocking that character. He doesn't need to speak. He communicates purely through his intensity and physicality. And he's the only actor I think could ever do this, and that's why this is ranked number 2. No big shock, it's a classic. I'll start with the score. It's fantastic. The theme is awesome. James Bernard uses a 3-note leitmotif meant to suggest the character's name. Dracula. This theme is only used in 2 films, but it's the most iconic of any of them. The story is a very, very loose adaptation of Stoker's novel, which kind of sucks. I like the novel quite a bit. It led to some confusion as a kid. It didn't make much sense that Dracula could get from England back to Transylvania by carriage, but of course he isn't. The English characters live in a neighboring country to Romania. The fact that everyone in the film speaks with an English accent led to this confusion. Even though the plot isn't faithful to the novel, I'd argue that the 2 leads are with their performances. Peter Cushing has a quiet intensity as Van Helsing. He's an intellectual that's seen as a little eccentric. Terence Fisher uses this character for another one of his recurring themes, faith versus reason. Where the Transylvanians are ruled by superstitious paranoia, Other characters like Dr. Seward are incredulous and bound to cold, hard logic. Van Helsing is the one character to navigate both waters. He's the ideal. He's the healthy balance between those two extremes. Christopher Lee is perfect as Dracula, making every minute of his screen time count. Like the novel, Dracula is introduced as congenial but mysterious. His savagery soon reveals itself, his next appearance on screen being a close-up of his face, eyes blazing red and blood dripping from his fangs. Lee plays the Count as a predator. Any niceties are a facade and a means to an end. I don't think it was an accident that all of Dracula's dialogue is delivered in his first scene. Lastly, and I think most notably, Christopher Lee doesn't play Dracula as sexy, because Stoker's character isn't sexy, and the sexual component of that novel has been vastly overblown by pop culture and academia, usually for the purposes of whatever sexual politics happen to be in vogue. Now, Horror of Dracula does have some sexual component to it, but much like the novel, it's not overstated. Even Dracula's pseudo-seduction of Mina consists mostly of him nuzzling her, which furthers the character's association with an animal. Each sequel upped the eroticism to varying degrees, but I've never seen Lee's interpretation of that character as being a sexualized one, and he himself remarked his surprise at being turned into a sex symbol. The movie can drag a little for those with modern sensibilities, but it's well worth watching. I have two favorite scenes that put this at the top. The first is the build-up to Lucy's staking. She moves in to bite her brother, when an outstretched hand brandishing a cross shoots out from right of frame. Van Helsing edges her further and further back before branding her with the cross. Peter Cushing's acting is superb in this scene. His steely eyes and determined expression sell that performance. My other favorite is the climax, arguably the most recognized scene of the movie. Van Helsing is chasing after Dracula in his castle, trying to catch him before he disappears into the catacombs. They get into a struggle, and Van Helsing almost gets bitten, but he manages to wrench free of Dracula's grip. He backs away from the Count, who's gloating at this point. Van Helsing suddenly notices light peeking out from the curtains behind Dracula. He sprints across the nearby table, leaps to the curtains, and tears them down, spilling light into the room. The Count screams in agony and starts clawing to get under the table. Van Helsing quickly grabs two candlesticks, puts them into the shape of a cross, and drives him back into the light. Dracula quickly decomposes into dust. There has never been a better death scene for Dracula, either from Hammer or any other studio. This one's perfect. There was an extended cut of this film made for Japanese audiences that was rediscovered and restored a few years ago. It has a few seconds added to Dracula's seduction and his death scene. It hasn't gotten a release in the States, though, unfortunately. Either way, this is one of the best Dracula films ever made. They may be dated in some respects, but Hammer Horror is my favorite out there. Hope you enjoyed this list.
Have a happy Halloween!